AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson here on your Tuesday afternoon. And as usual on Tuesdays, we speak to one of the great writers over at the Minnesota Reformer. Normally it's Patrick Kulikan, but he's on vacation this week. So very happy to welcome in Max Nesterak, who is the deputy editor of the Reformer and reports on labor and housing news. Find about what Max writes over at minnesotareformer.com. As today, we're mainly going to be focusing on some labor news, including how Minnesota is going to be impacted by some increases in the minimum wage beginning in 2025. We'll also be talking about how the Inflation Reduction Act has been a real boon for a number of unions that are having to do with green jobs. Plus, we'll be talking about the U.S. Department of Labor reissuing their jobs report saying that there were 800,000 fewer jobs added over the past year and how that might impact Minnesota. So lots to get to today. Max, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Always happy to be here.
Absolutely. So right now, Minnesota has a minimum wage that is set to rise to $11.13 an hour, or a 26% increase for some workers. Can you give us a brief overview of the changes to Minnesota's minimum wage law that will be taking effect in 2025, and specifically how those changes kind of differ from the current minimum wage structure we have in Minnesota?
Sure. So right now, Minnesota has two hourly minimum wages. One is for workers at large businesses with revenues greater than $500,000. And the other is for workers at small businesses, workers younger than 18, and workers on J1 visas. And so the higher minimum wage for workers at large businesses is $10.85. Places like Target, McDonald's, lots of places, have revenues greater than $500,000. And the lower tier wage is $8.85. Now, back in 2014, the last time the legislature voted to raise the minimum wage, they tied it to inflation, which began in 2018. So ever since then, the Department of Labor and Industry has looked at inflation and then adjusted that minimum wage up for those two tiers. But there was a cap on it at 2.5%. So the most that the minimum wage has ever risen in a single year since 2018 is 2.5%. And now what Democratic lawmakers did this year is they removed that 2.5% cap, raised it to 5%, and they also eliminated that lower tier. So now, starting 2025, all workers will earn the one minimum wage adjusted for inflation, which will be the $11.13 per hour. Now, if you're working at a small business, or you're under 18, or you're on J1 visa, that's going to be a 20% increase for you, going from $8.85 to $11.13. If you're at a bigger company, going from $10.85 to $11.13, that's about a 2.6% increase. So still larger than was allowed before Democratic lawmakers made those revisions this year.
So what I'm curious about as well is the idea that we raised the annual inflation cap to now up to 5%, which was an increase from about 2% that we had before. Talk about how this could be significant for a lot of low-wage workers, because especially during times of high inflation, because as I mentioned, prior to this year, I believe we capped that inflation adjustment at 2.6%, but that's quite an increase up to 5% now.
Right. For the lowest wage earners, this change probably comes about a couple years too late, because we had 2 years of really high inflation coming out of the pandemic or in the pandemic, and that's then subsided because of high interest rates. So, had this cap been higher, in 2021, 2022, 2023, the minimum wage would likely be much higher today. But, going forward, what this means is, in periods, if we have 6% inflation, if we have 5% inflation, the minimum wage is going to rise along with other prices. There is another push from some progressive lawmakers to readjust the minimum wage again. There was a bill introduced by Senator Zainab Mohammed this year to raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour. That didn't get very far. So depending on what happens with this election and where the party's at next year, it could be something that lawmakers take up again. And the argument being is that, with this high inflation and this lower cap, the minimum wage hasn't really kept pace with inflation. And what's more, it's not a living wage. What I included in the story is estimates by the Department of Employment and Economic Development of what does it cost to actually afford the basic necessities in the state, like food and housing, but not anything extra, not eating out, not vacations or savings. And they estimate that for a single worker with no kids in Minnesota, you have to earn at least $16.68 per hour. So there is still a wide gap between the minimum wage and what you need to earn in order to afford to live here without relying on public assistance.
And as you said, that's basically just bare bones costs as well, with basically, nothing for any sort of entertainment expenses or really anything you kind of need to live except the absolute bare minimums. Another angle I wanted to talk about with you has to do with what we're seeing in Minneapolis and St. Paul, who of course have a minimum wage set to around $15 an hour. So I'm curious, how do these changes at the state level affect workers in Minneapolis and St. Paul? Are there any planned adjustments in the cities, or are they largely not affected by what's happening at the state level?
As far as I know, they're not going to be affected what's happening at the state level. Minneapolis and St. Paul both have those tiers or had those tiers of small business and big business. Minneapolis, was phased in slower, so they both would end up in the same place, and they did. So now there's just one minimum wage, and in St. Paul, it's still being phased in, so there's still a difference between small and large employers, and there will be for a little bit longer here. Just the idea being that labor is a significant cost for businesses, and it's just much harder for a mom and pop shop to adjust to a higher minimum wage than it is for Target or McDonald's.
We can read more about what Max wrote on the minimum wage over at MinnesotaReformer.com. MinnesotaReformer.com is it's interesting to see how things are going to be impacted and how, again, over the past year with the state legislature, how many of the rules that applied to the minimum wage have changed, which could end up helping workers and low-wage workers throughout Minnesota. I want to talk about now another article you wrote, Max, that has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act and how it could be really helping a lot of green jobs in Minnesota, especially union green jobs, I should say. So as we talked about, really is transforming the labor force, building thousands of solar farms across the region and really the entire country. But what I'm curious about is what's changed with the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of why we're seeing many green jobs that are especially backed by unions right now.
So this story is based on a report from the Climate Jobs National Research Center, which is a labor-led organization focused on clean energy jobs, and they tallied up more than 6,000 utility-scale clean energy projects that could be eligible for IRA, Inflation Reduction Act tax credits that are also tied to labor standards. And it's those labor standards that are really driving the growth in union jobs in the green energy. So you get for many like solar farms or wind farms, you can get a 30% tax credit. But in order to get that tax credit, developers must pay a prevailing wage, which usually tracks closely with the local union wage. And they also must hire a minimum number of apprentices. Now, that also favors unions because unions may be the only game in town that has an apprenticeship program or that has, apprentices ready to go to work on these projects. So those two requirements have really driven owners of new green energy projects to pick union projects. And now that is to say, like the IRA does not require you work with a union shop. But what I'm hearing from union leaders, I talked to Jason George, who's a business manager for the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 49. They do energy projects all across Minnesota and the Dakotas, and he's saying he's hearing that, developers are being told this needs to be a union job because we know that will be eligible for those tax credits. So so that's why we're seeing that the IRA is spurring not just growth in renewable energies, but growth in union renewable energy jobs. So, compared to other states, Minnesota, this report estimates, Minnesota will, these 105 clean energy projects in Minnesota are estimated to create 10,000 jobs. And these tax credits go for a decade. So it could be much more, as they develop and more, developers look to take advantage of these tax credits.
Now, you also mentioned in what you write that many of the labor standards only apply during the construction phase of these renewable energy projects, which, of course, makes them eligible to get these tax credits. So, again, they generally only apply during the construction phase. So I'm curious what the implications of this might be, because as I understand that this largely won't apply to maintenance or after the project is completed, as you need that continuing maintenance, correct?
Yeah, so it's unclear what it remains to be seen what happens with those jobs. Thing is that the job creation is really in the construction of these projects. It doesn't take a whole lot of people to maintain a solar farm or maintain a wind turbine. Certainly, there is ongoing maintenance and there's jobs associated with that, but for the most part, it's kind of set it and forget it, and certainly not as labor intensive as, say, an oil refinery. So the IRA is really focused on spurring the creation of more renewable energy. So there's nothing in there that I'm aware of that ensures that these are union jobs in terms of the maintenance after it's built. So, for the next, again, like I said, these tax credits run for another decade. There's certainly, plenty of construction to be done. It just remains to be seen, what happens when we build all the solar farms that we need, which is kind of hard to imagine that day coming.
Well, you can read more about this over at MinnesotaReformer.com. It's fascinating to read because you often don't hear about this in the Inflation Reduction Act, as we were kind of talking about, that many of these new projects that are going to be built are going to be needing union workers, so they are eligible for those tax credits. So make sure you check that out over at MinnesotaReformer.com. One more piece of news I'd like to talk about with you has to do with what happened with the U.S. Department of Labor, because recently they issued a major revision to their job figures, which basically said the economy added about 800,000 fewer jobs than they had initially thought in the 12 months that ended back in March of 2024. So obviously that's a rather large number of 800,000 fewer jobs. But what I'm curious about here on our end in Minnesota is, how are we impacted in our state? Do we have any idea as to whether our numbers will be revised as well, or how Minnesota was impacted by these new numbers?
Yeah, so I reached out to the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development and was just asking about this because they've been releasing monthly job numbers, and they've been, noting that the state has added jobs in 8 of the past 12 months. And they say this downward revision, which again is part of a annual reconciliation between different data inputs that the Bureau of Labor Statistics get. And they say DEED says they do monthly revisions, and so this doesn't change for them what they've been reporting, or the fact that the state has added jobs in 8 of the past 12 months. And just another note on this, it is this 818,000 fewer jobs than initially reported is a big downward revision, and it's more than you typically see, and it comes on the heels of the sour jobs report last month, where the country saw far less job growth than expected, and that came along with rising unemployment that triggered something called the SOM rule. So that has raised concerns about a possible looming recession. On the other hand, an expert at the Center for Economic Policy Research, Dean Baker, notes that even if you look at the new figures and put it into monthly averages and compare that to the years prior to the pandemic, it's really kind of in line with what we saw before the pandemic. So with the revised numbers, we saw about 172,000 jobs added per month, which is just a tad lower than the monthly average of 179,000 jobs 3 years prior in the pandemic. So even with this large downward revision and kind of state of sour news we've been seeing in the job market, we're still having overall strong job growth. So it's, again, just this strange economy we're living in right now coming out of the pandemic. So.
Yeah, so in essence, really nothing too far outside of normal, even though you might see that large number and say, wow, that's a big adjustment. But as you talked about, largely the overall numbers are still going to be pretty much in line with what we have seen in the past. Well, we are just about out of time. We've been chatting with Max Nesterak, who is the deputy editor of the Minnesota Reformer, who reports on labor and housing, as we had a chance to chat about some of the latest labor news in Minnesota. Make sure you follow what Max and the rest of the great staff at the Reformer writes over at minnesotareformer.com. That's minnesotareformer.com. Max, appreciate you coming on the show today. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks. Always appreciate you having us on.
All right, let's take a break and turn things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.